object we're creating, a child object of our image. And we are setting it to be a new image itself. So an image object will now contain a whole nother image object. So it can store this information. When I talked about objects earlier, I said objects can contain other objects and so on down the line. All we're doing is adding onto an existing object. We're adding onto it. It's called outImage, and it's just going to be a new image. Now, because it's an image, it's going to have a property called source. So we're going to set that up. Remember how in the previous example we set up the source on both onMouseOver and onMouseOut? We're going to do the same thing here. This is the onMouseOut version. Now we know that the out version that we want is the current version that we see when the page is first loaded. And we know that we already have that. That's the image on the page. So all we have to do in outImage is store the current image that's on the page. And we don't have to go and find it or calculate it or anything. We've got that already. It's called thisimage.source. So that image that's out there has a source, and we just want to store it in outImage so that we have it later. And then we're going to set thisimage.onMouseOut so that when we roll over the image, an onMouseOver will trigger. When we roll off it, the onMouseOut will trigger, and that's going to be a function called rollout, which we'll see in a little bit later. The second part of setup rollover repeats the first part almost entirely, but with a new object being added to this image called overImage. And as you might guess, this is the over version of our image link. So here's overImage. It's going to be a new image again. And we're going to set its source. This time we have to calculate something because we can't just look at the image and say, okay, we know what the over version is going to be. So we're saying, well, we know it's going to be in the images folder. And we know it's going to end with _on.gif because that's the way we've set up all of our images so that they have an off version and an on version. And then to get the name of it itself, we grab thisimage.id. This is built into JavaScript. We know what the ID is of this image, and so we can use that to set up our value. If we go back to the HTML here, you can see that we're doing button 1 has button1off.gif, and button 2 has button2off.gif. Back in the JavaScript file, our last step in setup rollover is to do the onMouseOver event handler. And all that's going to do is call a rollover function that we're about to add. So it's kind of complex, but it's really not as scary as it might look at first glance. We're only doing two things here. We're creating an out image and giving it a source and giving it an onMouseOut handler. We're creating an over image, giving it a source, and then giving this image an onMouseOver handler. So now we need to change this file to add our rollout and rollover functions. So let's start off with rollout, function, rollout, have parentheses, curly braces, and then we add inside there this.source equals this.outImage.source. That is everything that function needs to do, and that's all it needs to do. If you've been following along, we've talked previously about this. This is a JavaScript keyword that's all based on context. There's no relationship between the keyword this and the name thisimage. This image here could be called George for all it mattered. Here in function rollout, it's a JavaScript keyword, and because we got into this function via an event handler, we know what's being passed, and what's being passed is an image. So we're just going to change the source of this image, whatever that image might be, and we're going to change the source to be the out version. So whatever the source is, we're rolling off of it. We want it to be the out or the off version of the image that happened to trigger this. And you might guess that rollover is pretty similar, and it is. Here's function, rollover, parens, curly braces, and it's this.source equals this.overImage.source. And that's all it is. It's triggered when we move the mouse over the image. It sets this.source to be this.overimage.source. Remember, we set overimage.source up here for every image inside a link on the page, and that automatically triggers it. Now, if we save our file and we go back to our browser and we reload our page, our buttons change. Notice we didn't have to change our HTML. And the nice thing is we could add buttons 3, button 4, button 18, and nothing would have to change as long as they were all named correctly in our HTML file. We wouldn't have to change anything in the JavaScript at all. So it's completely flexible. If you have somebody working in, say, a WYSIWYG editor like Dreamweaver, you can just have them go and add any buttons and any image links that you want. And so long as you have this JavaScript file being called by the HTML, as it is here, and all of your images are named in a standard fashion, you will never need to touch either the JavaScript or the HTML to do rollovers. But this could be even just a little bit better to add 3-state rollovers with an on-click, and we're going to do that in the next exercise. In this example, we're going to talk about using JavaScript to create 3-state rollovers, or rollovers that change not just when you mouse over them and then mouse out again, but they change to a third state when you click on them. So the users know that your links are really active and are doing something. Those of you with exercise files, we're looking at Chapter 6, Example 3, script.html, which looks just the way it did previously. The handy thing about doing rollovers this way is that our HTML file never needs to change. So let's move over to our script.js file, which is where things are happening. It's in the same state it was where we left it last time. So we're just going to add one more section to the setup rollover function. We've set up the version for when we go off of the image. We've set up the version of the image for when we go over it. Now we want to set up the image for when we click on it. And as you might guess, it's another 3 lines of code that are awfully similar to the previous 3. We're going to call it this image dot click image is a new image. This image dot click image dot source equals images slash concatenated with this image dot ID concatenated with underscore, and then in quotes again because it's a string, underscore click dot gif, and a semicolon at the end. That's going to be the name of our click version of our image. And then we also need to say this image dot on mouse down equals a function we're about to add called roll click. Then we go down to the bottom of the page and we set up our new function roll click with parens and braces as always. And roll click is just this dot source equals this dot click image dot source. Same as you would expect. And suddenly, so long as we have the right images in our images folder, suddenly all of our images are now 3 states. So we save this, go back out to the browser, reload the page, and now we roll over it. There's 2 states, and when we mouse down, it turns green. Button 2, mouse down, and it turned green. And that's what we're trying to do here. One other thing I should probably show you. It's important to set up a particular naming style for all your images, because in order to be able to do all the processing via JavaScript, JavaScript has to know what your images are going to be named. So what I've done is I've set up a style where, for instance, all the button 1 images start off with button 1 underscore click underscore off underscore on are all the versions of button 1 and then the ID for that image is button 1. And the same thing goes for button 2. There's something on the page with an ID of button 2. JavaScript knows that it can expect to find an _click, _off, and _on versions. I could call this home and about and products if that was how I was doing the naming scheme. And all I would have to do is change the ID on the page, and then the names of the images and the JavaScript itself would not have to change any. As long as I keep the naming consistent of our files, both in terms of the ID and in the _click, _off, and _on, JavaScript can handle finding it and setting it up. So if we go back to our HTML, you can see that here's our IDs, and as long as those are set correctly and consistently, then the JavaScript will work just the way it should. Now there's one more improvement we can make, and that's to make it a little bit more savvy for people with alternate methods of accessibility, and we'll do that in our next exercise. In this lesson, we're going to use JavaScript to make our rollovers more accessible so that people who, for whatever reason, in this case, may not be using a mouse, may just be using a keyboard or some other way of getting from field to field, can also see that your buttons are changing. If we switch over to the browser, you can see in our current state that if you tab in between the buttons, nothing changes. So you won't know necessarily that these are live. So if you're tabbing back and forth between various fields on your screen, it would help if you could also know that these are rollovers. Of course, your browser does have to support this and your operating system has to support this, but for the most part, modern-day browsers and operating systems are pretty good about supporting accessibility. You do have to change your preferences to allow this. But people who need to do this will have it set, so you need to make sure that your site works for them as well. So let's go back, and as we've talked about before, nothing is changing in the HTML file because this is entirely about the script. And what we want to do is go down to our setup rollover function, because that's where we're doing all of the heavy lifting for this. And we want to add some new lines of code. When we tab around the fields, we can tab not because those are images, but because those are links. So we have to change not